Welcome to Best in Class. I have the honor and privilege of helping individuals and organizations become best in class at what they do. And speaking of best in class, this interview today is going to be a special one. We have Zach Osterman. He is a veteran sports journalist who has covered Indiana University athletics for the Indianapolis Star for nearly 2 decades. An award-winning reporter and IU graduate, Zach is co-author of the upcoming book Unthinkable to Unstoppable, which delivers the definitive behind-the-scenes chronicles of the Curt Cignetti Indiana Hoosiers football historic 16-0 national championship season. And Zach also wants to shout out his co-author Mike Niesel. Can you pronounce it for me correctly? We just
Yeah,
did
it's
that.
it's Nizilik, Mike
Niesel.
Nizilik. Yeah.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And congrats to Mike as well on the upcoming book. This was definitely a labor of love and a lot of work, I can tell. And it comes out September 22nd. So pick yourself up a copy, pre-order it now, and I'm sure it's going to sell out. So get a copy. This is going to be an instant classic for sure. That's my prediction. I'm never wrong about these things, of course, but I definitely 100% believe in my heart. I'm going to get my pre-order for sure. And so Zach, so in your opinion, I'd like to start off with this one. Were the last two seasons of Indiana under Curt Cignetti the greatest coaching job in sports history?
It would be certainly, I think, very hard to argue otherwise. And I'm sure we can find, how do you match up Herb Brooks in the 1980 Olympics or, maybe a single season in baseball or something. I'm sure, there's no clean comparison. But when you consider all of the historical context of, within college football, obviously specific to Indiana and Indiana's, sort of own history is, rather sordid at times, certainly modest history in football. And then you sort of also consider this collision of sort of modern factors that allowed Indiana to maybe do this more quickly than, even Curt Cignetti has said would have been possible 10 years ago, within the sport, name, image, and likeness and the transfer portal and things like that. Um, it is for a host of reasons something that was really not supposed to be possible, and for it to have happened, not just you know that it literally occurred, but with sort of the force and velocity that it did, I think you can certainly make an argument this is certainly the best coaching job in college football history. And you would have to, well, we obviously have no empirical way of deciding this, you would have to put it next to really any sort of similar performance in all of American sports.
Oh, well said. That's right. It's somewhat subjective, but we can't really do it empirically, but that's a great analysis alongside those few that you named there, the Miracle on Ice story, and definitely in college football. I mean, I don't know anybody else who could have pulled off what Curt Cignetti did, and it was decades in the making. It was a 40-year overnight success story for Curt Cignetti, and you know as well as anybody, I mean, you know the situation maybe better than anybody out there. I mean, you covered it so well and so tightly. You had a front row seat to it. And I want to preface the rest of this interview with that this is for leaders of all types. This story, what Curt Cignetti did as a leader and the culture he created, whether you're a CEO, law enforcement leader, military leader, school teacher, a parent of children, a head coach of a team, the lessons here are really universal and timeless. And it's a great underdog story of where Curt came from and worked his way up through football and really had success in his 60s, at the highest level. It's a very inspiring story, for sure, and a lot of great lessons for all of us. So, what did Curt Cignetti do first to turn Indiana from a losing culture into a championship culture?
Yeah, he was obviously made a lot of news in those first few weeks when he got to Indiana, when he said, and I hope I'm allowed to use slightly off-color language because he did when he said Purdue sucks in front of the crowd at the basketball game when he said, I Google me, I win, Google me. And what's funny is, for the book, I'm pointing to it because I have a copy here. We talked to, among I think about 70 interviews, give or take. We talked to most of the players, if not all the players, that came with him from James Madison. There were 13 in all. And one of the things that they said was that they were shocked when they heard him start saying these things before they'd even joined him in Bloomington, before they even could, before the new semester had even started. They said he was always a confident guy, but and again, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to I'm not sure what kind of language I'm allowed to use, but he had a phrase that he used with them all the time. They said, "Don't let your ass overload your mouth," and they thought that's exactly what he's doing. Why is he doing that?
Mm.
And, I think at the time, those of us in the media and just in sort of college basketball pundit class thought, here's a guy who's just got confidence that, there's a Steve Spurrier-esque element to some of these sort of deadpans and things. What he was doing was very intentional. And what you find out with Curt Cignetti is that even if it's in some small way, virtually everything he does is somehow intentional. He walked into Indiana, and I mean, he's told this story multiple times. Basically, day one, he's greeted with what he feels like are just expectations that he's not going to tolerate. Well, we'd love to win 6 games. We'd love to go to a bowl game. We'd love to beat Purdue, who's Indiana's rival consistently. And he's thinking, that is not why I'm here. That has never been why I take a job. That has never been the way I approach a job. I'm here to win as much as humanly possible. And I need to basically reset first everyone's mind and get everyone to a place where they are completely unafraid of the idea of expecting something of Indiana football. And that is where so many of those, I think he's called it kind of coaching the fan base, in the aftermath. That first year, he said so many of those things, the emerging superpower in college football, and once or twice it backfired on him. He'd admit that, what he said on the set of Game Day before the Notre Dame game in the playoff in 24. But what he was trying to do was very purposeful. It was, I've got to get this place, believing in itself. I've got to infuse confidence here, maybe even a little bit of arrogance, healthy arrogance. And the more I think people spent time, both people who knew him from James Madison and also people that got to know him in Indiana, spent time around him, they started to realize that. And then they started to fall in line, and they started to sort of fall in behind him and say, if this is what this guy's preaching, then we're going to meet him there. We are going to, give him that, confidence he wants. We are going to start sort of believing at a different level, setting our own expectations at a different level. And again, what you find the more you talk to people about Curt Cignetti and his process is just, again, how intentional everything is. And one of the first things he felt he had to do at Indiana was essentially zero in on that idea of expectations versus versus sort of confidence, and he had to raise all of those levels before he could do anything else because his ambition needed to be matched by the ambition of the people around him. And of course, it helps when, Indiana starts 10-0, right? Like in that first season, everything is validated very, very quickly. But from day one, that was sort of the first kind of, on his checklist. That was at the top was, I've got to get this place and these people believing that what I think is possible here and what I intend to do here is possible.
Oh, that's the best explanation I've heard yet on any TV show, whether it was game day or a podcast interview, on what he did and why he did it. And all great leaders, I believe, know these two things for sure. One, leadership is part theater, and number two, the greatest leaders are the greatest psychologists. And that's not my opinion. There's good science that backs this up. Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer, who I had on the podcast, I think he's the world's greatest leadership scientist at this point. He says you have to make people feel a certain emotion. Whatever that emotion is, as a leader, you've got to make them feel the right emotions, whatever they need to feel in that moment. And for Curt Cignetti, it was confidence, whether it was the fan base, the players, or both. He knew that he had to instill that. Now, Jimmy Johnson, one of the greatest football coaches of all time, was also very intentional. He wrote a book called Swagger, which is an excellent leadership book, and he talked about how he did that at Miami with the Hurricanes. And it's the science behind it is the Pygmalion effect. And he would say, Jimmy Johnson would say, we got to Pygmalion them, meaning the Pygmalion effect is that leaders have an actual, their belief in the people that follow them can have an actual belief on their, or effect on their performance. And that's what Cignetti was doing. He was putting the theater on and he was also creating that self belief in his team. What a master of both those things. And it pays off. I mean, I think overconfidence is a moral obligation if you're a leader. Your confidence, like you said, a little healthy arrogance is good when you're a leader or you're a performer. Now you've got to back it up with the work ethic and the fund and banging on the fundamentals and be brilliant at the basics, as John Wooden said. But overconfidence is a moral obligation as a leader. A healthy arrogance, a little bit, your confidence has to be a little bit ahead of your performance at all times, or sometimes a lot at Indiana, as Curt knew. So the next question I had is, what is the one thing Curt Cignetti does as a leader better than almost any other coach you've observed in your long career?
Yeah, I think there's an easy answer to this question that is again sort of hard to just sort of like empirically identify in like 10 words or less, but it is when you see the results that you can kind of recognize it. It is his ability, and by extension, the way he builds this into his team, um, to remain solely focused on the task at hand. That that Indiana just like every coach strives for this, right? Like the whole, we're only worried about the next game or the next practice. It's only about what's in front of us. We're never looking ahead. But especially when you deal with college age people, that's very hard to do. They have other distractions. They have to go to class. They have social lives. We all know when you're 19, 20, 21 years old, yes, you're legally an adult, but you're hardly a fully formed adult in terms of your own sort of process for understanding how to manage your time or how to how to again like zero in on the task at hand without any kind of distraction. His ability to keep his team focused solely on what's next and what matters, that is something every coach strives to do. He does it at a level that I've never seen before.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean Indiana doesn't make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, obviously. But I've covered 27 Curt Cignetti coached Indiana games now. And not once did I feel like I saw an Indiana team that was maybe looking past an opponent, playing down to the level of its competition, not focused on the task at hand. That didn't mean Indiana didn't struggle sometimes, but when they struggled on the merits of the team they were playing. They struggled because, even if Penn State, for example, last season, people will remember the very dramatic ending. Even if Penn State had a disappointing season, Penn State was still a team with probably 24 future NFL players on its roster. Maybe Iowa wasn't the most impressive team in the world. But in the book, Curt Cignetti has weekly. We talked to his athletics director Scott Dolson. Cignetti has weekly meetings with Dolson, tells him basically this is how I think the game's going to go this weekend. And Dolson said, it's pretty remarkable how often the game unfolds the way he told me it would. Iowa was a game that from the very beginning he said this is going to be really tough for us because they don't make mistakes, because they are so clean and so well drilled, and they make you beat them just basically on your merits. And if you have to go on the road and play a team that tough and that disciplined in a very difficult environment, again, that's a test of your focus. That's a test of your toughness and your sharpness and your attention to detail. And when you hear, like former coaches who are now analysts talk about watching Indiana on film, they say, what I'm drawn to is the details, how clean the blocking is, footwork, just little things, that little pieces of execution that you might not notice, that might not occur to you if you don't have 20 or 30 or 40 years of watching film religiously to sort of look for gaps and look for weaknesses and things like that. But all of that comes back to every time you hear something like that, or every time you see it manifested in the way that Indiana performs on the field, it all comes back to the idea that Cignetti never loses his own focus. I think he has, and the book kind of captures this, a real ability to, through developing his own process over however many years as a coach, keep what is important to him and shave away anything that is not, and then do the same with his players on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. And that is why I think, when you see Indiana in, no matter who the opponent is, again, there is just maybe if the opponent's tough enough and disciplined enough and talented enough, then Indiana will have to work to win the game. And sometimes, obviously, Indiana's not been good enough on talent or depth to do that. They, those two losses in his first season. But Indiana doesn't lose games. Like Indiana can get beat, but Indiana does not beat itself because Indiana is constantly as focused and as disciplined as any team I've ever seen. And that obviously starts with the head coach.
Oh, well said. I believe every organization is a reflection of the leader at the top. It eventually takes on the personality and the habits and the confidence or lack thereof, the attention to detail or the lack thereof, the passion for the fundamentals. And whether it's a CEO of an organization or a head coach, that organization eventually is going to take on the personality for good or for bad. And the separation is in the details, as Tim Grover said. He was Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant's performance coach. And I love that you brought up the details and also the time. What would you say Curt Cignetti's time management secrets are? In terms, he runs the shortest practices, maybe in college football, and gets the most done. What did you notice that separated him in terms of time management that we could learn?
Yeah, it's funny because in coaching, I think, and you'll talk to athletes about this, especially maybe after they're done playing for a certain coach. um, there is always a temptation to make quantity seem like quality. That practices need to run as long as possible because we don't want to feel like we left anything out on the field, or we need to use the maximum complement of practices. Curt Cignetti's never done that, and Mike talks about this a lot because Mike has covered three or four different college football programs. I've consistently covered. I did a little bit of time with Notre Dame, mostly Indiana, um, but neither one of us have ever seen a coach who did not use spring football. You get 15 practices, 15 full practices. Curt Cignetti's, according to him, and certainly, I mean, obviously, I did not cover him at James Madison or Elon, but I've seen this at Indiana. According to him, he has never used all 15. Like he's never felt that he needed all 15. Um, there are no clocks at Indiana's practices. He times the whole thing on his watch. And like when it's time to move on, he blows the whistle, everybody moves on. Um, he has some of the shortest practices in all of college football. Again, in a sport where I think there's always a temptation to equate quantity to quality. He says, less can be more. But then I think that the turnabout is, why does that work? I think there are a lot of different reasons. In terms of why does it work in practice, for example, well, it keeps your players healthier because you're not overworking them. You're not wearing them down. If you have, let's say you could have 2 hour practices, 4 days a week, and every week those practices only average an hour and a half. Well, that means you're taking a full practice out of your players' bodies every single week. If you want to think about it that way during a season, that's an entire extra practice that's not wearing them down. So it keeps them healthier. Indiana's had good luck with health these 2 years. Cignetti's teams at James Madison did not. Every once in a while you're just going to have an injury crisis, but for the most part they stayed healthy. I think that's a big part of the reason why. I think it breeds again that focus, that sharpness, that attention to detail into your roster because I think one of the things that you know, at a normal college football practice, there will be like basically like clocks on wheels, wheeled up into all the corners of the field, so everyone can see how much time is left in a drill. But then I think there's also maybe a human instinct if you're watching that clock to think, well, I've only got 2 minutes left in this drill, so I can take it easy, and then I'll get a break. And if you don't know how much time is left, then your focus is solely on getting the most out of that drill until the whistle blows, and then you can move on. It's not necessarily a time specific. It's not necessarily a time specific sort of example, but it speaks to the same kind of idea of focus. Cignetti has this tradition where he lines everybody up. Um, After a practice. He does it a few times a year, and he has them run like I think it's 40-yard sprints, and he has them run 10, and he blows the whistle, and invariably somebody basically saves their best sprint for last, and he spots them, and he says, "What are you doing? You should be falling over the line on the 10th sprint. If you're saving." And all the experienced players, all the guys who played with him for years said we came to understand what he was doing when he did this. He'd make everybody go back and do it again. And his point was, I don't want you to run until you just can't anymore, but I also don't want you to think that the first nine sprints are any less important than the 10th. I don't want you saving for the last sprint because I don't want you thinking that the second quarter is less important than the fourth quarter. You should simply be giving maximum effort at all times. And if maximum effort on your 10th sprint is less than the first nine because you're so tired, that's the point. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And again, it's the same idea as, sort of don't be worrying about how much time is left in your drill or practice. Just focus on getting the most out of that drill. But then the flip side to that is, what is the advantage of that? Players come to realize, A, this is how I get better, but B, he'll respect our time. He's not wasting our time. He's not making us do things that aren't necessary. He's not wearing us down or causing us to miss class or causing us to miss meals, but by unnecessarily extending practices. We talked to a man named Paul Tortorella, who was his defensive coordinator when Cignetti was the head coach at Indiana University, Pennsylvania, his first stop, IUP. And Tortorella was his defensive coordinator and then took the head job when Cignetti left IUP for Elon. And now Tortorella is still at IUP. And a phrase he used with coaches is he said, "You were never chained to your desk." Cignetti was the same way with his coaches. We're going to come in, we're going to work hard. I expect your full focus and attention, and I expect your best, and I expect you to meet all the things I ask of you. But once you're done, if you've done it all, you can go home. You can have a life outside of the facility, where a lot of coaches would say, "I need you here for 15, 16, 17 hours." And listen, some people work better that way. Some people work better when they just work and work and work. But one of Signetti's strengths, if you want to talk about sort of why his teams have won so consistently, is staff continuity. And one of the reasons he gets staff continuity is because while he can be an exacting boss and he can be tough, and obviously he's just as dry and maybe sometimes, sort of direct with his coaches as he is in the media or with his players or whatever, they also know he respects their time and he appreciates their work and he values their contributions. And if they do their job and they do it well, then they are going to get that respect back, sort of sent back to them from their head coach. And all of these things, what I hope the book captures is, in different ways, people like me have written stories about him keeping practices shorter, or him keeping time on his watch, or him not using all 15 spring practices, or him not maybe, creating a culture where his coaches need to be in the facility for 20 hours a day. But when you do those are to torture a metaphor. Those are the trees. Those are the individual trees. And what I hope the book sort of paints is the landscape of the forest. Here are all of the different ways that his process manifests, such that he gets buy-in from his players, he gets loyalty from his coaches, he gets continuity, he gets consistency, he gets hard work, he gets focus, because all these little things over time teach everyone around him this is how it adds up. And this is how we make the small things become big things.
Oh, well said. At the end of the day, the small things do become the big things. It's a thousand small things. And I think that really separated Saban as well. He was just 1 or 2% better at everything. Everything. Maybe there wasn't a 20, 50% gap between him on, certain things, but it was at 1, 2, 3, 5% better at everything. And I love that you brought up, there's so much gold there in your answer, and I can't wait to really, unpack it in the book. Um, the respect factor, I think, is huge. And I've heard Curt Cignetti talk about he hated when people wasted his time. He hated when leaders wasted his time, so he never wanted to do that. So he respects people's time. And again, that's reciprocal because he respects their time. They respect him more. And there's more of a loyalty sense. And also that he appreciates their excellence and their hard work. And with those sprints, that was a great story about the 10 sprints. I've heard him talk about how you do one thing is how you do all things. How you do anything is how you do everything, which is a great leadership mantra. I did an episode, it was actually my most viewed solo episode on the podcast. It was the 7 leadership secrets of Curt Cignetti. And that one definitely stood out. That attention to detail, how you do one thing is how you do all things. And then at the end there, you tied it up in a bow in terms of all those little things stack up to a historic 16-0 championship run. And in the book, like you said, it's going to give us the whole forest, but then also each individual tree, which I think is missing overall. I don't think anyone's done that yet in terms of this. Now, I haven't found it in all my research that someone's been able to do what you're doing here in the book. Next question I had was, uh, what did you learn about how Cignetti builds extreme confidence and belief in his players?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, it's no one thing. Like one of the striking sort of just underpinnings of sort of telling the story of Curt Cignetti in Indiana is this isn't some, like he didn't unlock something schematically that no one else was doing. He didn't reinvent offense or something the way that, if you think about and I'm not taking anything away from some of these coaches, but you think about the way like, Oregon did something that football needed 5 to 7 years to figure out how to defend, and that made those Chip Kelly Oregon teams great. There were other reasons too. Chip Kelly's a really good coach, but my point is, Cignetti didn't invent something schematically. Now he's a great coach. He's a great X's and O's coach. He's constantly studying film. He's constantly studying, sort of trends and things and adjusting his own thinking. And he's even talked about literally making hires because he saw something a coach was doing and he wanted to go hire somebody that worked with that coach to bring them to Indiana to bring some of that into his offense. That's the idea of, hey, he might be 65 years old, or I think he's 65 now. But he's always trying to learn and improve. But he didn't reinvent the wheel in a way that just sort of gave him like a head start on some evolution in football. It really is more in the intangibles and more in the fundamentals. And I think, I mean, you talked about like leadership is theater. Sometimes I'm constantly drawn back to a line from the old show West Wing, where the president's chief of staff says, "Have faith, and faith will be given unto ye." In other words, fake it till you make it. Anybody who's coached, and I've kind of randomly, like I've coached competitive cycling at an amateur level, so nothing like college football. But even in that, there is always a little bit of an extent to which you're coaching someone's mind and you're coaching someone's ego, and that if they believe they are 5% better, they will play 5% better. And that's one of those things that like people hate. People like me hate because you can't quantify it, right? There's no analytic that will tell you that, but it is true. If you go out more confident, if you are sitting there before the game and you're saying, I'm more prepared than the guy across from me. I'm better coached than the guy across from me. I'm healthier at this point in the season than the guy across from me. You're just going to play a little bit more confidently, and that can make a difference. That can make a real difference. And I think there are some things that you can quantify. His teams are experienced. I know they're not. We kind of overdid the Indiana was a team of 26-year-olds thing last year. Like I think Miami's average age was actually higher than Indiana's average age in the national championship game. But experience does help, especially in a physical sport like football. If you can stay old, no matter how talented the 19-year-old sophomore might be, if he's facing a fifth-year senior who's got literally 10,000 more reps, practice reps, weightlifting reps, conditioning reps, all that talent's not going to make up for experience. And experience brings confidence too. Obviously, just success breeds confidence. I mean, one of the things that really I hadn't thought about until we reported the book. And again, I'm struggling to think. I think we might have talked to every single one of the 13 JMU transfers that came to Indiana. Um, he actually, and I, because so much of what Curt Cignetti does is intentional, I believe at least at some level this was every position room except quarterback that first spring that he's in Bloomington in 2024, before he's coached a game, every single position room, once his roster's settled out and all the transferring is done, has at least one JMU transfer in it. Except maybe quarterback and I guess defensive back because D'Angelo Pons didn't come in until after the spring semester. But the point is, in almost every position room, not only is there maybe in a lot of cases a coach who knows him and knows his process, or a strength coach who knows his process and knows how to explain to guys this is what Coach Cignetti's going to expect of you and all that. But there are also players who can say, this is why we do this drill this way. This is what this terminology means. This is what the coaching staff is looking for when they show this on film. And those players, to your point about confidence, well, those players have already done a lot of winning with Curt Cignetti, and they won with him when James Madison was in the FCS. They won with him when they came up to the FBS in the Sun Belt, and they were picked to finish last or second to last in the Sun Belt, and they won a share of the league title. And then the next year they did even better. And so they can say, "Listen, I am proof that this guy and these coaches with him, their process makes us better. Their offense will platform you, or their defense will platform you in a way that will get the best out of your skills. They will see things in you that maybe you don't see in yourself. And if you listen to what the coaches say, what the assistants say, what the coordinators say, what the head coach says, if you train the right way, if you follow these habits that we have learned and developed from the years with him, you're going to have that success. And I think that's where we took, there was a lot of discussion of sort of transplanting sort of his culture at James Madison at Indiana. And I think a lot of that discussion, as especially as last year evolved, um, really wound up centering on the talent of the players and the idea that he picked the right players first at JMU and then to bring with him to Indiana. And obviously that was part of it. But I think what was lost was maybe that idea of what those players also brought with them collectively, that they were able to sort of look at these situations and say, trust us because we've been in your shoes. And we have stories from players, Mikael Kamara was an All-American defensive end at Indiana. We've got stories from him, running afoul of one of Curt Cignetti's, one of the little things. And we could talk about it if you want, as a freshman, and him being like, Coach, I don't get it. Why is it such a big deal? And Cignetti says something like, who do you think you are, that you think you're better than everyone else here? And then Mikhail telling us 4 years later, I'm seeing him doing it to another freshman or a sophomore, and I know what he's doing. Because that was me 4 years ago. And now I'm here and I'm an All-American on the number one team in the country. And we're competing for a national championship. And I know what he's doing because I've lived it. And I didn't understand it then, but I do understand it now. And I think that's where that confidence comes from, or excuse me, where the success and the development comes from. A big piece of it is giving players that confidence that, basically just tell them, then show them. Tell them that this process is how you're going to get them better, and then show them by the results on the field. And, we had more than one player who could draw a line for us from some moment they remembered as a freshman or a redshirt freshman or a sophomore with Curt Cignetti, all the way up to being a senior and looking around and saying, we're competing for a Big Ten title, we're competing for a national title, and we're doing that because this process that I bought into, it works. And the proof is what is happening all around us every day.
Mm. So a lot of the confidence came from the process and him bringing the
Yeah.
process in, and that we have a proven process and believe in it, and you'll be great too. And then again, the psychology of instilling confidence, the mental part of it, but maybe 70% of it was from you'll be excellent if you follow this process. We've got a track record of success, and our players will tell you that. A mentor of mine, Dr. Jason Selk, he was the performance psychologist for the St. Louis Cardinals when they won 2 World Series, and then went on to work with 40 Olympic gold medalists. And he's talked about how confidence is 70% that work ethic, that process, and 30% mental. That's what he's seen over a few decades of working with the best in the world across pretty much every sport. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about, that 70% process oriented, trust in this, do the work, and you'll get the results. What was that story? I heard you talk about another podcast with Kamara. I think that story, but I'd love to hear it on this one. It was a good one.
Yeah, basically, so like you talk about, I said earlier that Cignetti is able to identify that at least what to his process is ephemera, like it's just not important, and just sort of to just throw it away. Like Indiana doesn't have slogans. They don't, there's not a lot of rah rah in who he is as a coach. That's just not his personality. He is very Saban-esque in that way, though. It's funny because like when for people who maybe know a little bit of college football history, I've always said there's more Steve Spurrier in him than Nick Saban, at least to my perception.
Mm.
He's not quite the, I'm going to be on the golf course at 5 p.m., come hell or high water that Steve Spurrier was, at times. But I mean, he didn't work for Spurrier, he worked for Saban. I know why that comparison sort of comes, but one of the things that I think both of those coaches and Cignetti too had the ability to do is just say all like to identify very quickly, this is drag. That this just isn't important, and so I'm just gonna move it out of the way. But there are also things that he recognizes that to his process anyway are important. One of them is um, everyone wears. I think it's like white cleats or black cleats. Everyone wears the same color socks.
Mm.
Basically, um, let's say it's the opener is we're talking on August 27th. The opener is September 5th. He'll basically post, here's the colors we're wearing this week. And he doesn't care if you wear like the arm sleeves or the leg, the tights or whatever. He's fine with that, but it all has to be the same color. And he had this kind of moment that was made headlines back in the spring where a prominent transfer, Nick Marsh from Michigan State, came
Mm.
out for his first practice in gold cleats, and Cignetti sent him back inside to change. He's done like almost every player who's played for him for a substantial length of time that we talked to had a story about him either sending them or someone else back inside for something as simple as different colored socks. And Kamara said, "Coach, I don't get that story specifically." He said, "Coach, I don't get it. It's just socks." And that was when Cignetti said, "Who do you think you are?" But there's sort of the twofold, I think, in sort of purpose behind stuff like that, where another coach might look at that and say, "Yeah, it is just socks. I'm not worried about that." And maybe another coach with their process, because no two coaches are going to win the same way. Maybe another coach in their process, that's fine. That like that works. Maybe there's something else that they do that Curt Cignetti's decided is extraneous and unimportant to him that works for them. But for Curt Cignetti, these are the details that he chooses to focus on. And when you talk about like why is everyone wearing the same color socks, I think there's two things. Number one, the less you're worried about, I'm going to have these color cleats and these color socks, and I'm going to have like the flashy like arm sleeves and all this different stuff, the more you're thinking about what matters, which is the game. And maybe like if we're talking about one single game, does that matter? Maybe not. But if we're talking about building a mentality that says, I'm not thinking about looking good, I'm thinking about playing good, then again, over time, those little things add up. But then I think there's also the second part of that is you use the phrase the way you do one thing is the way you do everything, and I think that if somebody asked me to distill sort of Curt Cignetti's leadership down to one sentence, I would say I can't, but the best one I would choose would be that one: the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. If you can't commit to the simple discipline of everyone wears the same socks, of everyone follows the same sort of uniform color scheme, of every that in the end, that's not a difficult thing to do. If you can't commit to the simple discipline of that, you might struggle with the broader discipline of what it's going to take to command the details to be a good defensive lineman or a good safety or a good wide receiver in our offense or in our defense. And again, I don't think it's one of those things where Curt Cignetti would stand there and say, I make you wear the same color socks because of these rhetorical or existential reasons. But over time, you will come to realize those are the reasons why, not because someone spells it out for you, but because you lived the experience long enough as a player to come to understand this is why he does it. And this is why it matters. And like I said, virtually every player we talked to had a story about either them or someone near them being sent back inside to change, like even on game day, coming out for like stretching on game day, and Cignetti being like, "Nope, back inside, change your socks, change your cleats. That's not going to fly." Um, Not every coach would do that, and I don't think necessarily every coach has to do it. I don't think Curt Cignetti would tell you that his process is the only one, but it's the one that he's developed. And over 15 years as a head coach, it is hard to argue with the results.
Well said. Well said. And you brought up Nick Saban and Steve Spurrier, and it's often talked about Nick Saban and Curt Cignetti because Curt has said that he got his PhD from in football from Nick Saban in the past. What would you say are the biggest similarities and differences between the two of them that you know?
Well, I mean, similarities, I think they are both creatures of extreme habit, and that habit leads to the regularity, the consistency, the focus, and then everything that happens around them. I think they are both not just excellent evaluators and developers of playing talent, because I know, we love to talk about Nick Saban, and yeah, he got all these great recruits, but he also made a lot of those players better, but also coaching talent. When you look at and Cignetti's coaching tree is obviously, less, sort of less spread because he's not necessarily been in jobs where people are going to come picking at his staff all the time. But you look at some of the coaches that have worked for him and gone on to other places. He left head coaches behind him at both IUP and Elon. Um, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised when these coordinators, move on to head jobs at some point in the not so distant future, or NFL jobs, or maybe both eventually. Um, I think some of the differences, number one, and I don't want to turn this into like a football guy conversation. I always have believed though there is there's a fundamental difference between offensive coaches and defensive coaches. Like offensive coaches don't mind a little chaos. Offensive coaches are constantly trying to um, innovate and stay ahead. Defensive coaches are constantly trying to disrupt and control. Like that's just the nature of those two sort of opposing, philosophies. And Cignetti is very much the CEO of his program, but like any coach, Tom Allen before him often said, I leave the offense to the offensive coordinator. I sit in on some meetings and things, but I'm a defensive guy. I'm much more defense focused. Cignetti will tell you the same thing in reverse. He spends a lot more of his time in the offensive room. He's very trusting of his defensive staff because he knows he's an offensive guy at heart. He was a quarterback. He spent, I think, I want to say his entire assistant coaching career as an offensive assistant. Um, and so that, that there will always be some different dynamics there. And I also, again, think that, Saban was a really confident guy, but I don't think he ever would have heard Nick Saban say, Google me, or, relative to the job he was at, Auburn sucks. That there are still I think some personality differences there. And I think that when, people sort of perceive like that Saban and Cignetti have this sort of strange relationship, and I don't know if that's true, but I've covered enough coaches to know that, sometimes when you get sort of connected to one coach that you worked for, I think you almost feel uncomfortable sort of not giving credit to all the other coaches who informed sort of your upbringing in the sport and development of your philosophy. And as you said, I mean, Curt Cignetti said that he learned more about, building and running a program in like 4 years with Curt Cignetti as opposed to the 27 year or with Nick Saban as opposed to the 27 years or whatever it was previous as an assistant. But I think he also wants to go out of his way to say, but I learned a lot from Johnny Majors and Walt Harris at Pitt. I learned a lot from the coaches I worked for early in my career, even if we didn't always have a ton of success. Of course, the one that I think maybe informed more of sort of who Curt Cignetti is, probably as a person, but certainly as a coach than anyone else, is his father, Frank Cignetti Sr., who was a Hall of Fame football coach at West Virginia and then at IUP. And Frank Sr. is, the probably as big of an influence on Curt as anyone. And so I don't think it's a necessarily a situation where the sort of impact of Nick Saban's, sort of mentorship, if you want to think about it that way, or certainly even just relationship with Curt Cignetti on Cignetti's career is like overblown. I think Cignetti just always wants to sort of say, yes, but I also learned a lot from these other people. I don't want to forget these other mentors that I had that taught me about quarterback play. Or, I mean, he'll tell you that so much of just basically his choice to go into a football life was watching his dad do it, watching his dad go on recruiting trips, watching his dad in the locker room and on the field and with players and things like that. And so when he talks about all that stuff, you are reminded that, there was there Cignetti often, when he talks about his time as an assistant, it's usually framed through people asking him why it took him so long to find his way to a big, a power four head coaching job. And he'll often say, I was on staffs that didn't have a ton of success, and people aren't necessarily always eager to hire assistants away from programs that aren't winning. Um, but I think what he's also trying to say is that didn't mean I wasn't learning then too. That didn't mean that I wasn't picking things up then that I still use now. And again, he's very deferential to Nick Saban when he talks about all the things that he learned. In particular, I think about running his own program, maybe not just like football concepts or how to teach this or how to why you would use this drill in this situation, but literally sort of the job of being a head coach. I think he took a lot of that from his dad and then a lot of it from Nick Saban. But I think he's eager to also talk about some of the other mentors he learned from throughout his career as well.
Oh, I'm really glad you brought up the mentors and his mentor tree and how important they were. His dad, I think, like you said, was maybe the biggest one in terms of football and also life. And he's talked about his dad so fondly and the kind of habits his dad had and the mental toughness his dad had. And it's a great lesson for everybody listening on the power of mentorship. I mean, I'm a firm believer in show me your heroes, I'll show you your future. And it's so important to choose the best heroes in life. And you can define heroes in many ways. I define it personally as mentors, role models, teachers, anybody that you respect and admire how they do things. And I think Curt really soaked it all in because it's one thing to coach for Nick Saban, it's another thing to really soak in the best of the best practices on running an organization. So I challenge everybody who's watching or listening, really think about who your heroes are and what mindsets and habits and strategies you want to emulate in your life to be successful. How about Fernando Mendoza? You had a front row seat to one of the greatest college football performances because he was not on the Heisman list before the season. He wasn't talked about at all. What were some of his mindsets and habits that made him such a great performer and a great leader?
Where to start with that? I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time around Mendoza, really, even just like, through the lens of watching press conference footage and things like that to recognize that he is one of those people will, that has a goal that he will work toward, you know, as relentlessly as anyone else. That, you know, the cliches all apply about 5:30 a.m. throwing sessions, and we heard stories that kind of even as early as like the first month of last season that um, basically coaches would find him in the quarterback's room by himself watching film long after everyone was gone. Maybe his brother was there too. His brother's a big part of it. His family's a big part of it. A lot has been made of, his parents made him and his brother share a room growing up, even though they had another bedroom in their house. And that fostered a togetherness, but also a competitiveness. As their high school coach told me that he thought Alberto became a quarterback specifically to prove he was better than Fernando. And they're very supportive of each other. It's not a conflictive relationship. But when you have that, when you have someone so close to home constantly pushing you to get better and constantly challenging you in that sort of competitive way, that's going to bring a lot out of you too. I think Fernando Mendoza is someone who is very appreciative, and I don't think that's by accident that that's part of his success. When he talks about um, appreciating the opportunity at Cal, because he was committed to Yale when Cal offered him a scholarship. So that's it's not like he had multiple Power Four schools sort of banging down his door out of high school. It was, I think Cal might have, I believe Cal, and it was an 11th hour offer. It was like right before signing day, and Cal came in, and Cignetti told Justin Wilcox, who was there. Cignetti, forgive me. Mendoza told Justin Wilcox, who was the head coach at Cal, because Mendoza's, I think he's also well traveled now. His idol is Tom Brady. Um, Mendoza told Justin Wilcox what supposedly Tom Brady told Robert Kraft when he drafted him, is this is you what is it, something like you just made sort of the best decision for your franchise that you can imagine, or I think something, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote in front of me. But Mendoza's always been drawn to Brady because of Brady's story, not just because Brady was great, but because of what Brady had to overcome, The different moments at which Brady was doubted, only starting for 1 year in college and obviously being drafted in the sixth round and things like that. Like the Mendoza family, is his dad told me once, because they've lived in Miami. They would always go to every Patriots Dolphins game, and they would all show up wearing Tom Brady Patriots jerseys, because that was just, Tom Brady kind of became, sort of a hero, to use that word that you used a minute ago, in Mendoza's life. And then I think you also just you know you also have to credit the player he has made himself into. I mean, physically, the throws he can make, and things like that, but then also the way that he can talk about and process football. And a lot of that comes from work ethic and preparation. Cignetti has said he described Mendoza as basically about as hardworking as any quarterback he'd ever had, in terms of, just how much time he spends on the field, how much time he spends in the weight room, how much extra time he puts into, the game just on his own. But then Mendoza, like any athlete, will tell you that's where a lot of his confidence comes from. Because if he has those things, if he does that extra work, then when it's time to make it count in a game, he has the confidence that he's ready. He has the confidence that he's, and there's stories in the book, and this isn't uncommon, but I think it is illustrative of, the connection the head coach, the offensive coordinator, the quarterbacks coach, and the player all built last year. There's stories in the book of moments when, Mendoza might have seen something in the moment, or even on the sideline, Indiana might have introduced something that really they'd never practiced before. But because Mendoza had that, certainly the physical tools, but also the mental strength, the confidence, and everyone just sort of had that connection that was built over essentially just long hours of working together, trusting one another, and growing together. Um, they could just say, "Hey, we've never done this before, but we think it's going to work in this situation," and say, "All right, yeah, let's just give it a try." And so it's there is. I mean, this sounds easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, but there is something a little bit different. I've covered a few athletes that have sort of separated themselves, and I think about like Lily King, who was an Olympic gold medalist, and obviously different sports. Swimming is a largely individual sport, and that requires its own sort of mindset in terms of how you train and how you get better, and where you find your edge. But Victor Oladipo, had maybe a not dissimilar sort of story to Mendoza. Was recruited out of high school, but certainly no one would have looked at Victor Oladipo out of high school and said, "There's the number two overall pick in the NBA draft in 5 years or whatever." But players that just had athletes that just had sort of, forgive a cliche, a relentless will to get better and to reach their goals. And Mendoza has that, in addition to, I think, having, a certain charisma and toughness that just cause people to follow him. I think one of the most important moments of the season, I'm rambling a little bit here, forgive me, but I
No,
think
it's
one of the
great.
most important moments of the season quietly was, and you could even spot it kind of in real time, the last play of the third quarter of the Iowa game. It's 3rd and 15, I believe. And Mendoza drops back, sort of rolls right, scrambles, tries to run for the first down because he's got room in front of him. He stretches for the first down marker and gets hit hard, clean hit, but he could have protected his body and come up a yard or two short. He didn't. He exposed himself to hard contact, and he wound up getting checked into, like an equipment trunk on the sideline, and he was down for a minute, and there was a little bit of a scrum because his teammates were trying to sort of stand up for him, and it wasn't a dirty hit or anything, but just sometimes that happens. But in that moment, any number of teammates we talked to, when we talked to them about the Iowa game, they said that was the moment I knew that my quarterback was going to do whatever it took to win me the game. And so that only deepened my sense of resolve to follow him, to support him, to protect him, to fight for him, because I knew he was going to fight for me. And when you have all the individual stuff, all the individual talent and work ethic and focus and drive and ambition and belief and confidence, and then you can couple that to being able to show your teammates, I'm going to I'm going to give you every ounce of what I have. When the quarterback will do that, the nominally best paid player on the roster, the most prominent player on the roster, usually the player that's the star for better or worse. When the quarterback will do that, anybody will do that.
Mm. Well, that was the deepest, best explanation I've heard about Mendoza yet, which makes me even more excited to read the book than ever because I've read everything I get my hands on since the Google Me quote 2 years ago about Curt Cignetti. I thought this guy's doing something different, something special. Let's see what's going on here. And I've read every article and listened to every interview I could about him and also Mendoza, and that was just gold. And anyone listening who's a leader, whether young or older, should listen to that again as Zach just described, the mindset, the habits, and then the leading by example combination that made Mendoza special and a national champion and a Heisman Trophy winner. And you mentioned about Mendoza's mindset and confidence, and I'd read that he hired his own sports psychologist. He invested in his own. Are you aware of that? How he did that? And does Indiana have one as well?
Indiana has personnel in that area. I don't know whether or not Fernando had his own sports psychologist, but to your point, though, I do know he took a public speaking course at Cal, like sort of this is adjacent, but it's the same idea. He took a public speaking course at Cal, specifically, obviously, for the idea I want to be a better public speaker, but also for just the idea of here's how I'm more confident. Here's how I present myself a certain way. And obviously anyone who's seen a Fernando Mendoza interview knows he has a certain cadence and he has a certain sort of enthusiasm and the way that he delivers answers. So much of it traces back to that. But again, this is where I think that the quarterback and the head coach, really kind of like met very serendipitously as the season went along. Like Curt Cignetti, Fernando Mendoza is very intentional. He does things for a reason. He wanted to sort of better himself, so he took a business major at Cal who had an NFL future, took a public speaking course because he wanted to better himself in a way that, listen, I mean, I've covered enough football to know you don't need a public speaking course to get up in front of a microphone and give a bunch of cliches and then, walk down off the podium and be done. That's the way most athletes, tend to think and tend to work. Um, Mendoza wanted to be something a little bit more. He wanted to find another source of confidence, another source of, just sort of outward projection. So he does that. Um, again, he is an incredibly driven individual. He is one of those people, and this is a cliche, but he's one of those people that you sort of look at and you say, if he weren't successful in the NFL, he would be incredibly successful in business or in finance or like whatever he chose to do. When sometimes we see athletes and we say, if you gave that athlete a year of elite level training, they could play, one of any number of sports because they're just so athletically gifted that they could play baseball if they wanted to, or they could play soccer if they wanted to, or whatever. Mendoza is one of those people that is just, I think, so driven, so focused, so smart. Um, he chose football. If he'd chosen something else, I think he'd be successful at that too. It's that is just sort of like his makeup. And if you get to know his parents at all, if you get to know his brother at all, his two brothers, we didn't really get to know his youngest brother because obviously he's still in high school. We got to know Alberto somewhat well because he was with him at Indiana. You understand that is just that family. They are a remarkable group of people. And I think when you put, you know, part of the story of what happens last season specifically for Indiana is this sort of weaving together of all of these personalities. And of course, 10 years ago, 20 years ago in college football, that would have happened over 3 or 4 years. Now it has to happen in one or two because players can transfer. And, Mendoza, Cignetti's only been Indiana's head coach for 2 years. Mendoza was only, Indiana's quarterback for 13 months, essentially. Um, but over the course of the season, all of these things weave together and tie together. And the story of, Fernando Mendoza next to the story of Elijah Surratt, next to the story of Aiden Fisher, how all of these people grew together is a lot of what I think organically not just made Indiana a stronger team, but also made the story more remarkable. And probably, my co-author, we mentioned Mike Neislich, is very fond of this story. Um, Nothing better illustrates that than, and we got a lot of great stuff on this than, people might remember when Fernando Mendoza wins the Heisman Trophy. A bunch of his teammates flew out to New York, and they did that essentially on a whim. Like it was basically like a week or two. I think it was the week before. Pat Coogan, Indiana center, said, "What if we did this?" And of course, because of NIL and things, they have a little bit more, a
Hmm.
little bit more sort of money than you or I might have in college. And within a couple, like it just started like a, hey, wouldn't that be fun? And within like 48 hours, everybody's got a plane ticket, they got hotels. Now remember, they can't attend the ceremony. Like it's a closed ceremony. Everyone has a limited number of tickets. Like it wasn't like you could just bring them into a big amphitheater. That's not how the Heisman Trophy works. But they flew out to New York. They went to a charity event that Fernando put together at Adidas's flagship store in Manhattan. Then I think they ate a steak dinner the night and watched the Heisman Trophy. Then they crashed the press conference, which is sort of more open after the Heisman is announced. I think it might have been Ralph Russo from The Athletic told Mike, because Mike was at the Heisman Trophy. I was at the IU Kentucky game the same night. Um, that he'd covered 20 some odd Heisman ceremonies and never seen anything like that. And the guys that we talked to that went on that trip, they said, that was that they made as many formative memories essentially in that trip as they did any single moment throughout the season. And it really illustrated, I think, and they also, interestingly, they also said they kind of needed it because, the previous 13 weeks or 15 weeks or whatever had been just this constant ratcheting up of pressure and interest and expectation. And now they're going to be the number one team in the country. And there's going to be the expectation of them going into the playoff. And obviously, you're physically tired because football is a physically demanding sport, even if you don't have, some kind of injury. The release of just getting to share that time together and just getting to sort of celebrate one of their teammates, but I think by extension, all of them, in some way, and just what the journey that they were on together, they came to realize after the fact that really helped them mentally to release and to refocus and to prepare for the playoff. And so I know we were talking about Mendoza, but that I think even Fernando Mendoza, if he were here, would tell you you can't tell the story of my 2025 season at Indiana without that of my teammates. And the way those things wove together over the course of the season is part of what gave Indiana, I think, its strength.
Wow. What a great story. I never heard that one. I never heard that one. And it had, like you said, unintended benefits of resetting their mind and getting them focused to just change scenery and also celebrate their teammates. And you said it earlier that appreciation. I thought that was a great quote. I've been taking notes as you've talked here and about being appreciative, how important it is being appreciative is to success and that them showing him appreciation and them, Fernando showing them appreciation led to this great moment, in New York City, right? That's where the Heisman is. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
oh, and like you said, it all, it was a seamless web. It was all these parts and these moments that all came together and details, a thousand details that all added up into something special here. What was a standard or habit that had the biggest impact on Indiana's performance that Curt Cignetti put into place? If you could think of one standard or habit that you saw him just lock in with everyone, was there something that stood out to you with Curt?
Yeah, I mean, and we've probably talked about it in different ways, right? Like we've probably sort of, picked at the edges of it. I think with him, it has always been his consistency. The idea that practices are run this way. Expectations in the weight room are these. This is how the day will be structured. This is how the week will be structured. Famously, I don't know, not famously, maybe not famously, but certainly distinct to Signetti, he when he takes his team on the road, they will get to where they're going later than almost any other coach because he is not like we asked him about ahead of his first season. Indiana was going to play UCLA in their Big Ten opener in the Rose Bowl. It's going to be the first game for one of the Pac-12 teams in the Big Ten.
Mm.
And it was going to be the first time Indiana had been to like the physical Rose Bowl, the stadium where UCLA plays its home games, since Indiana went to the Rose Bowl in 1968. And so we asked him, what's this going to mean? Are you excited about it? And he was like, I mean, no, we're just like, it's just an old stadium and we're going to go out there and try to win. Um, like he, if Curt Cignetti could get on the plane the morning of the game and then get on the plane the moment the game ends, he would do it. Obviously, he can't because there's rules. You have to be at the site like 24 hours in advance or whatever. But that is again part of his sort of, we're not going to go spend a bunch of sort of dead time in a hotel just sitting around waiting because we decided we needed to get here at 9 o'clock in the morning instead of 7 o'clock at night. We're going to we're going to arrive at this time. We're going to eat dinner at this time. We're going to have our meetings at this time. Everything is just so consistent all the time. I mean, to the extent that one of my favorite stories in the book, and I heard about this during the season, but there's kind of the omerta of the locker room. People don't want to break that sort of sort of that sort of trust. And also, again, you're always just focused on what's next. You're not looking back at what happened before. Um, it's anyone who's played football at any level knows it's fairly common that the last thing a team does before they leave the locker room is say the Lord's Prayer. It's just a way of sort of just like a team camaraderie thing. You put a hand on the shoulder of your nearest teammate. Everyone bows their head, and you're basically just asking whatever higher power you might believe in for a little bit of protection and strength ahead of the physical challenge of a game, and then you get up and you leave. Indiana does that. Curt Cignetti normally leads it. At Oregon, um, and like many visiting locker rooms, Oregon's visiting locker room is quite cramped and not very not particularly let's say luxurious, certainly as compared to the home locker room. That's a pretty consistent theme in college sports, college football. Everybody is just like crammed in this little like trailer like thing almost, and they everyone says what they need to say, does what they need to do. They stand up. Cignetti heads for the door, and to give you an idea of like what a creature of habit he is, his strength coach Derek Owings realizes Cignetti hasn't said the prayer, and the fact that it occurs to him tells you how in tune everyone is with the consistency of Cignetti's process, that it even just sort of occurs to him immediately. There's this one thing that we always do that we didn't do. And Derek Owings has sort of this like very brief internal argument in his mind. If I speak up, he might be annoyed I spoke up and get on me later. But if I don't, he might forget, or he might get mad that nobody reminded him to do the prayer.
Mm.
And so he says, Coach, uh, you forgot the prayer. Are we going to pray? You forgot the prayer. And Cignetti turns around and he says, I did. And then he checks his watch and he says, well, fuck it. Pray for Oregon. And he turns around and he runs out of the locker room and he heads out onto the field. And again, I find it hard to believe that there was not something in Curt Cignetti that maybe that was intentional. There was meant to be a bit of sort of a dramatic moment in front of his team, like one more, because they had a great deal of confidence going into that game of, but one more sort of like they're the team that's in trouble, not us. But that story also gives you an idea of Cignetti's habits are so consistent. His routine is so consistent. His process is so consistent that the people who are inside of it recognize that consistency and any break in that consistency almost immediately. And that is again where I think, why does the process work? Also, why do people buy into it? Why do coaches stay with him? I mean, Owings left for Tennessee this year, but I think he'd been with Cignetti for 6 years, 5 or 6 years before that. Both of his coordinators have been with him for the best part of a decade now. I think one of them even more than a decade. You talk about all the players that came with him from James Madison. You talk about the players that have stuck with him at Indiana. Indiana has consistently, over these last like 3 years, been one of the, if you sort of rule out the roster turn that happens um, when there's a coaching change, because there's just inevitable churn when that happens. But in every subsequent transfer portal cycle and transfer portal window, Indiana's been one of the sort of least drained rosters. Guys stick with Cignetti. They stay loyal to Cignetti because they stay loyal to the process. And I think one of the reasons that process works, one of the reasons he is so successful is because he's so consistent with it. And I think that's, um, Indiana, when Indiana went into the coaching search process in November of 23, they wanted a head coach. They were not shy about hiring somebody who was older because they wanted a head coach who had that experience, who had a wealth of experience running his own program. And I think what they saw, what they recognized in Cignetti almost immediately was that he had confidence in that process, and there was proof behind it working because of coming into Indiana was 13 winning seasons in 13 years. Um, but they also could recognize very quickly once he got to Indiana just how consistent that process was and how sort of religiously he adhered to it and how that was a big part of why it succeeded at the level that it did. However, you want to quantify that, in recruiting, in development, in retention, in staffing, or certainly in wins.
Mm. Maybe lastly here, and then we can get your thoughts on the upcoming season with Indiana. And I appreciate all this time. I appreciate you giving us so much time and a really great look at the program and what's going to be in the book. In terms of mindset, Curt has said that Coach Cignetti has said that the first thing he does when he goes into a program is change how people think. He said we have to change how people think to turn it around. Were there any books or documentaries or performance psychologists he brought in, used? Were there anything you noticed? Was there a book in the program people read, or books or documentaries, or
No, no, this is kind of like if you want to say the genius of Cignetti is, it really is him in a lot of ways. And he did have he talked about it and tweeted about it a little bit. Doesn't really refer to it as much anymore, but he did have like this little handbook that he developed over basically his entire head coaching career. And at the time it said like the JMU blueprint or whatever. And so James Madison fans thought that that was him taking all kinds of trade secrets out of James Madison, but it was essentially just like a spiral bound book that he developed over years and years. And it's interesting, and this is maybe sort of a tangential commentary on like how college football hires and values coaches, but um, he actually talked about this at the Rose Bowl. At the Rose Bowl, Indiana was facing Alabama, coached by Kalen DeBoer, who had actually a similar sort of journey in coaching, had played NAIA football, then coached at his alma mater, won, I think, 3 national titles at a very sort of low level of college football relative to, the SEC, the Big Ten. And then wanting to move up in the sport, had basically taken a series of smaller offensive coordinator jobs and worked his way up to, eventually had jobs at Fresno State, Washington, and Alabama. And obviously, one of the big talking points around Cignetti is how long it took him to get a head coaching opportunity, and the fact that he went from Alabama, where he was winning national championships and coaching, future NFL Hall of Famers, going all the way down to Division II, and taking a pay cut just to be a head coach, and the phrase he loves to say is, "I had 3 kids who wanted to be doctors, and I took a pay cut, right when they were all about to go to school." Um, but he said something at the Rose Bowl, and we explored a little bit in the book, but we kind of covered a lot of bases when we talked with Curt, in a short space of time. But he said I got to make my mistakes early, and I think what he meant by that, if I'm allowed to sort of, and this is a dangerous thing to do with Curt Cignetti, sort of put words in his mouth just a little bit. I think what he meant by that was I got to make my mistakes in a time and a place. Yes, I came to head coaching later. I obviously had a wealth of knowledge, from a career in coaching just as an assistant. And again, we talked about, I have the Nick Saban experience of how to run my own program. But I think he also meant I got to make my mistakes in a time and a place where um, they wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't be saddled with them forever. They wouldn't be broadcast on ESPN. They wouldn't be fodder for sports talk radio and First Take and all the game day morning shows. Look at this huge mistake that Curt Cignetti made. He was doing this at IUP. He was allowed to sort of trial and error a little bit, and he was winning while he was doing it. So it's not like he went there and screwed all kinds of things up. But he was allowed that process of sort of when we talk about him being able to identify, what's important and what's not. Well, he was allowed years, maybe working away from the glare of like a Big Ten job to figure out what was important and what wasn't, what his process needed and what it didn't. And so by the time he gets to Indiana, really even by the time he gets to James Madison, because I asked him once, basically, when did you know your process worked? And he said it was at Elon, which was his second head coaching job. Um, when he was able to turn that program around, they'd only won like 12 games in I think the previous 4 or 5 years, and he took them to the FCS playoffs in his first season there. Um, by the time he gets to James Madison and he gets to a place where maybe there is a little bit more of a spotlight, a little bit more of a glare, he's refined this process. And he would say he's never the finished article, but by that point he at least has that blueprint. And when I mentioned like there is a physical binder, there's a physical sort of booklet that he keeps that has a lot of the principles and a lot of the processes that he leans on. But I sort of tell that story to reinforce the idea that it really is Cignetti. He doesn't bring in all kinds of motivational speakers. He doesn't do like team outings. Like they don't all go to play paintball together, or there's a couple lakes around Bloomington. They don't all go to the lake together. Maybe they do, you know, organically, like when they all went to the Heisman ceremony together. But it really does start and end with him and with his process and his ability over 15 years as a head coach, plus however many more before that as an assistant, to refine his own working process into something that he can literally put in a book. And maybe someday he'll write one for all of us. I don't know. Um,
You'll be the
but
co-author if he does. I hope
well,
I hope you're the
yeah.
co-author.
Well, he's got to read this one, and we'll see. We'll see if he likes this one first, probably. But you know, it 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 really is his ability to distill down his own process, and then even as sort of an extension of that, to also recognize what can be compromised on, right? Like I mean, like the quarterback thing is a great example. His last four starting quarterbacks, not even counting this year, were all transfers. And each one of them was a little bit different. Skills wise, each one of them had, different strengths and different weaknesses. He knows what these are the principles that underpin my success that can't be negotiated, but these are the ones that I can adapt to the player. Here's where I can make the mountain meet Muhammad, so to speak.
Mm.
And here's how I can take four different quarterbacks and build the same offense around each one of them a little bit differently, but to get the best out of their skills. And every one of those quarterbacks has been all conference. Three of them have been conference player of the year, and one won a Heisman Trophy and a national championship. And so when you talk about like his process and again, what he distills down into that book, he's also able to say, but here is this, and I think it's almost just innate or instinctive. Here is this whole other set of principles and things that I can adapt to the personnel that I have, to the situation at hand, to the challenge at hand. You think about, I mean, he spends 3 years at the FCS level competing for a national title at James Madison. Then he spends two more just trying to get James Madison adapted to a higher level of football, and the winning doesn't stop. And it's because he understands here are the things that are non-negotiables, here are fundamentals, here are the pillars, here are the things that maybe are negotiable, that maybe have to be negotiable so that we can remain fluid and so that we don't become so, sort of rigid to the point of being dogmatic and at some point, sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face, which is another trap that I think you can fall into as a coach. When you start to say, no, 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 the player always has to, I have all these great ideas. The player always has to meet me where I am. He understands what he has to demand out of the player, but then also where he, as a coach, where his staff can be fluid and can say, we will meet them where they are. Um, I will. I tell this story a lot when it's Curt Cignetti. The best distillation I ever heard of coaching was from actually a story about um, I'm a big soccer fan, and I forget the man's name, but he was an assistant for years at Manchester United, and he was holding like this sort of what we would call like a coaching clinic. I don't think they use that term, but something like that. And he said, "This is the most important lesson I can teach you about coaching." And he takes a tennis ball and he throws it at someone, and they catch it. And he said, "Was that hard?" And they said, "No, I can catch a tennis ball." And he said, "What if I'd thrown two tennis balls? What if I'd thrown three? What if I'd thrown five? What if I'd thrown 10?" And obviously the person admitted, "Well, I'll drop some. If you throw 10 tennis balls at me, I can't catch them all." And he said, "That is the point of coaching. I will always know more than you. I will always know more than the players that I coach because I've spent so much more time in the sport than they have. But coaching isn't what I know, it's what I can teach. It's what I can get over to my players." And I think Signetti's ability to understand what he can demand out of his players, but then also what he has to do, what his staff has to do, what everyone around him has to do to best prepare and develop and instill confidence in those players. His meaning of that is why he is the secret sauce, is his ability to find that intersection point so consistently and so successfully.
The tennis ball story is one of the best stories I've heard on almost 200 episodes in terms of leadership. That is just priceless. That is so important for every leader to understand. And then lastly, for every leader to understand, because my question was, did they bring in books, speakers, documentaries on performance psychology? Answers no. And that's the answer. That is the lesson there, that you as a leader of your household, sports team, organization, whatever it is, you need to be the best performance psychologist you can possibly be. And that includes habits and process and being easy to understand. Throw one tennis ball at people. It includes instilling confidence. And you don't have to get a PhD in this, in performance psychology. Relentless Solution Focus by Dr. Jason Selk on my bookshelf here is excellent. His book, 10-Minute Toughness, or Dr. Eric Potterat's book. He was a performance psychologist for the Navy SEALs and the Dodgers. These are simple books. Wisdom of the Bullfrog by Admiral William McRaven. I mean, just those three books right there, you'll be better off than 99% of leaders. So that's my challenge to everybody listening. Become great at the psychology of performance like Coach Cignetti. Now, lastly, Zach, and again, thanks for all your time and expertise here. Excited for the book, September 22nd. Pick one up on Amazon, and we'll talk about it at the end or wherever you can buy books. What will determine whether Indiana's championship season becomes the beginning of a new standard rather than a one-time breakthrough? And what will happen this upcoming season?
Yeah, it's interesting because in terms of the one place in the book where we stop short, I keep looking, I keep pointing at it. I'm sorry. I just like it's a device over here. It's sitting next to me. Was really talking about this team's legacy because we don't know what it is yet. If in the next 10 years there are five more programs similar to Indiana in terms of their history and their resources and things that rise up and win national championships, let's say, Texas Tech and Vanderbilt and I don't know, BYU, Georgia Tech, whatever,
Right.
then we will say Indiana was at the vanguard of something. Um, if in 10 years, nine of the next 10 national champions are Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, and Oregon, then we will say Indiana was probably in a class unto itself. In terms of the way that it just reversed its history and its fortunes. Um, but what I am confident in saying, because I can't tell you which of those is going to happen. And probably as these things go, it'll be a little bit of both. But um, what I am confident in saying is Indiana's not going to stop winning because there's nothing in Curt Cignetti's history that tells me he is going to stop winning. Now, at some point, Indiana will have a season where they had bad luck with injuries, or they'll have a season where the schedule's more difficult than we perceive. This year, for example, um, I think they're going to compete for the Big Ten again. I think they're going to, therefore, I think they're going to compete for if you can win the Big Ten in modern college football, you can win a national title. I'm not sitting here and predicting they're going to win a national title, but if I think they're a Big Ten contender, that by extension means I think they're a national championship contender, and I do. But some of their most difficult games this year come back to back, whereas last season almost all of them, they had either a bye week or maybe a comfortable sort of run of easier games between the bigger, more physical challenges where they could rest, where they could kind of collect themselves and really go again in these big moments, at least until the playoff, obviously. And so you'll always need a little bit of luck. You'll always need a little bit of circumstance. That's inherent in any sort of championship sort of chase or certainly any actual season that ends that way. But what I don't think is changing, because for all these reasons that we've talked about, all these things that underpin Curt Cignetti's success, procedurally and structurally and culturally, as long as he is here, I think Indiana is going to remain, something akin to what Indiana has been and what all of his programs have been, what all of his teams have been. 15 winning seasons in 15 years from Division Two to, and frankly, he has described it this way: an FCS job at Elon that probably relative to its station might have been a more difficult challenge at the time than Indiana, to an FCS national championship contender at James Madison that turned into an FBS sort of transition program during Cignetti's tenure to obviously a Big Ten program at Indiana. The constant has been his process works and his process wins. And specific to this team, I think they have more back than people realize. It's easy to forget when you see 9 guys drafted and 16 or 17 in NFL training camps, how many starters, how many All Big Ten and All American level performers Indiana returns from last season. And I don't think there is any, and again, this very much comes from the head man. I don't think there is any sort of complacency or reveling in what Indiana did last season. There is just an almost sort of professional kind of confidence in this group that I think comes from saying all we've done when we've bought into the way we work under this head coach is win. So that's all we're going to keep doing. I think if anything, there's, certainly Indiana's going to be the hunted instead of the hunter and all those cliches. But I think within that roster, within that locker room, especially because there are so many players back from last season, on both sides of the ball or in all three phases, really, that I think there is just a sense of, you know, we are like we know that these habits, we know that these processes, we know that the way that we work, whether it's in practice or the weight room or the film room or whatever, it can win at a championship level. And there's just a confidence basically that, the things that we are doing are going to keep winning. In college I rode in a bike race at Indiana called the Little 500. And one Sunday afternoon, my senior year, and my team was good. We were competitive, but we were never a leading contender to win the thing. One Sunday afternoon, my senior year, a friend asked me if I wanted to like grab a beer and watch NFL games, and I said, no, I gotta go do a 3 hour ride. And he said, you do all this work and you tell me you're probably not going to win. What are the teams that are going to win doing? If you're telling me that like you're going to spend your Sunday afternoon riding for 3 hours and somebody else is still better than you, like what are they doing?
Hmm.
And obviously, the Little 500 is nothing compared to winning a national championship in college football. But I think that what you have is what you see in this group is a team that is confident that whatever it's doing, whatever its process is, day to day, week to week, they just look at it and they say, we buy into this fully because we're confident in it, because we know it can win. We know what can come at the end of this because we've seen it, we've lived it for the last 2 years, and because this head coach has lived it for the last 15. And as long as that remains constant, I don't know if Indiana's going to win another national title, under Curt Cignetti. That's a hard thing to do, but
Sure.
I don't see Indiana receding meaningfully in terms of its sort of ambition, its confidence, or its competitiveness as long as Curt Cignetti's around.
That makes a lot of sense. It does. Where can people find the book, find you? When does it come out?
Yeah, so it's on Amazon now, and we are first time sort of authors, which means we are first time booksellers. our understanding is for anybody who wants to pre-order it, Amazon is kind of the place to send them. That's just like, I guess, how the mechanisms of getting a book sort of on its feet work. It's out September 22nd, at which point get it kind of wherever you buy your books. Our expectation is there will be a Kindle edition. I believe there will be an audiobook edition. I'm not sure if it will be ready the day of launch. Kindle edition, I believe, will be. So for
Right.
people who, like my wife, tend to read things more in that setting, that is available as well, or will be available. But it is available for, I mean, if you prefer like Bookshop or Barnes and Noble or something like that, it's there as well. But Amazon is kind of the place we've been pushing people now. And then, once it's out, we're just happy for anybody who wants to buy it anywhere. I mean, like we were excited to find out it's going to be stocked in one of our local independent stores in Bloomington yesterday. They had we walked in and they said, "Oh, we've already got a few copies. Would you mind signing a couple of them for us?" So,
Great.
um, like I said, we're both first time authors in this. We've been journalists a long time, but never written a book before. So we're kind of learning about flying the plane while it's taking off. But it's been a lot of fun, and yeah, the pre-order on Amazon out September 22nd, and I really do genuinely appreciate conversations like this because listen, selfishly we want the book to sell, but also selfishly we put a lot of time and effort into this, and we hope people enjoy it. And I said this in a conversation that we had about the book earlier this week. I'm fully aware that this is probably the best story I'll ever cover in my career. That that in the same way that I've always thought this phrase is a little bit morbid, but it is apt. In the same way, so many of these people, I think, this season will be one of the first lines in their obituary, in some way, shape, or form. This season will probably be the one that I remember the most professionally covering as a reporter. And what I saw and how I tried to tell that story and how I tried to meet that moment. I think Mike would say the same thing. That's why we were moved to write the book, and that's why we hope people can get a hold of it and enjoy it.
Mm. I was already excited to read it before this interview, and now I'm 5 to 10 times more excited. And I appreciate your hard work and Mike's hard work on creating this book because I really do think you covered something special, and the book will be something special because it's one of one as far as I could tell. You got the best look, and you're a scientist as well. I mean, you really broke it down into what is and what isn't, here. And yeah, I'm very excited to read it. And thank you again. Best of luck with the book. Not that you need it. I would say anybody listening, get a copy as soon as you can because it's going to sell out. I would say so. Get your copy as soon as you can. Go to Amazon. Yeah, thank you. Honored to have you again. Thanks for your time and expertise.
No, thank you for having me. This has been great. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Oh, good, good. Looking forward to the next conversation.